A little bit louder? Okay, a little bit louder. There we go. Okay. Well, I remember meeting Salman back in 2007 in Konya, the city of Jalaluddin Rumi, the year that they were celebrating around the world the 700th birthday of Rumi, and a lot of great events took place. So I'm very grateful for my friendship with Salman Chishty, who himself is intimately connected to Ajmer Sharif, which is one of the great centers of Sufism in South Asia and indeed the world. And I'll ask him a little bit later to say a few words about the place of Ajmer, which he is uniquely qualified to speak about. So I should add that I am representing one half of the authorship of this book, Sufi Martyrs of Love. The other half is my good friend, Bruce Lawrence. We have worked together for many years, and we wrote this book together. And when we came up with the title, we were thinking of a line of poetry which was recited by Baba Farid Ganj Shakar, the great sheikh and ascetic whose tomb is in Pakpatan in Pakistan. And he delivered this line to Nizamuddin Auliya, who would become his principal successor and who is perhaps the most prominent Sufi saint in Delhi. And this is at a time when Nizamuddin was very young and shy. But Farid had been waiting for him, and he said, "Ey atish-e faraqat, dilha kebab karde, selab-e ishtiyaqat, janha kharab karde." The fire of longing for you has consumed my heart. I won't say it made a kebab. And the flood, there's a fire of separation from you has consumed my heart, and the flood of longing for you has ruined my soul. And at this, Nizamuddin could only say, "I am honored by being able to kiss your hand." But the two were intimately tied together, and Baba Farid had a presentiment of this. But we thought that line was so amazing that it led us to come up with this title. And this is an academic book. It's a historical book, but it's evoking some very powerful, emotional, and experiential questions. And I want to explain a couple of the problems that we've faced. One of the major questions we wanted to ask is, what is a Sufi order? What is a Sufi order? And when we use the English language, we are using words which actually come from the history of Christianity. Because a religious order would be like the Benedictines or the Dominicans, the great Catholic organizations which are highly bureaucratic and are sanctioned by the Pope and have various stipulations. And what we're talking about, the Sufi traditions, the terms which they use are silsila, which means a chain. And if you think of the links of a chain connecting one to another, this would be a master and disciple. And the chain goes all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad. This is the principle of this. And it is a relationship which is created through rituals of initiation, which include a handshake. And that handshake goes all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad. That's one of the ways in which it's traditionally defined. Another way we talk about these traditions is as a tariqat, or Arabic tariqa, which means a path. And you could also say that it means a method, a teaching, a practice that is transmitted from master to disciple. And so one of the questions was, what is the tariqat, what is the method the Chishtis that might make them different from others. And just to foreshadow that very quickly, we decided that the two essential practices for the Chishtis are sama, which is listening to recited poetry in musical form, and zikr, which is the recitation of the names of God. Now, the Chishtis are not unique in these practices, but they have developed them in very distinctive ways. But I want to go back to the question of this tradition, and a tradition means something that's handed down from one generation to the next. And we were trying to ask the question, what do we mean when we're talking about this tradition? So we did what scholars always do when they start a project. We did a literature review. What has been published about the Chishtis, and what does it say? And we discovered something that was very surprising. There is such a tendency to go back to what people call the golden age of the earliest sheikhs who are famous and highly revered, and focus the attention on them. And we found that among the publications about the Chishtis, well over 90% of the publications were about the very earliest figures in this lineage, which is the historical time that we know the least about directly. Because the earliest sheikhs did not write books themselves, and so what we have is oral transmission about them. And this notion of a golden age it raises questions. Why is it a golden age? And does this mean that everything else that follows is in decline? We found a very interesting story that was told in the 1600s by a sheikh in Gujarat named Muhammad Chishty, who was part of a very important branch of the Chishtiya. The Chishtis spread all over South Asia and are, I think, certainly the most widespread Sufi group in the entire region. So this sheikh was in Gujarat, and you might say this is from the period of decline, if you believe in the golden age. But someone approached him and said, "Sir, today there is no one who is worthy of sama, of listening to music." The sheikh was surprised by this. He said, if there was no one worthy of sama, of listening to music, the world would be destroyed. But the man persisted, and he said, there is no one today of the caliber of Sheikh Nizamuddin Auliya or Sheikh Nasiruddin Chirag Delhi, his great successor. Muhammad Chishti said to the man, people said the same thing to them in their time. In other words, back in the 13th century, people were already talking about the decline of Sufism from the earlier age. And in fact, if we go back to some of the earliest writings, Sheikh Ali Hujviri, Dada Sahib, in his book written in about 1070, quotes an earlier Sufi who said, once Sufism was a reality without a name. Today it is a name without a reality. And so one of the things that we discovered when we started to look at the later literature of the Chishtis is that it starts to expand and become gigantic during the Mughal era, and all the way up to the end of the 19th century. We find particularly the Chishtis are well known for a classic form of literature which is called the Malfuzat, which means the oral teachings. I'm wondering how many people here are familiar with the book called Fawa'id al-Fuad. Is anybody? This is an unbelievable book which Bruce Lawrence translated from Persian. And it's essentially a diary that was kept in the presence of Nizamuddin Awliya by one of his chief disciples, who was Hassan-e Dehlavi, one of the great Persian poets of all time. I mean, the Iranians are somewhat, shall we say, arrogant at times about being the only ones who can control the Persian language. But the Iranian critics have always acknowledged that Hassan Dehlavi was one of the great ones. And so he would he would listen very carefully to what happened in the conversation with the sheikh. And he would go back and he would write up his notes as a diary and then show it to the sheikh for correction. This gives us an unparalleled glimpse into the daily life of a Sufi master with the people who are his close disciples. And I strongly recommend it to you. The translation by Bruce Lawrence is called Morals for the Heart. Morals for the Heart, and it's a beautiful translation. This text is an example of this kind of literature, and we have writings of the same kind that are produced all the way down to the end of the 19th century, and nobody has written about them. So there's a vast archive of wonderful material, and anybody who is contemplating a journey into scholarship on this subject, I can assure you there are many important tasks to be done, and to uncover the transmission of these teachings in later times is certainly one of them. So this is a mismatch. In other words, if the scholarly literature is talking only about the earliest period, which is available to us primarily through oral teachings, and the scholars have ignored the later proliferation and growth of this, I think that we need to improve upon that and make it more available. So we discovered a series of other texts which contained a repeated idea that what was crucial in each generation was to revive the practice, the traditions, and they use the term sunnat. And for those of you who are familiar with the language of Islam, the term the sunnah or the sunnats of the Prophet means the moral example that is set by a person of the highest rank. And so to revive in each generation the moral example of those great ones, that is what keeps a tradition alive. It's not simply by saying how great the people were in the past, but by bringing that into the present, that it can be preserved. So now there's two other aspects that I want to talk about briefly, and I have an illustration of this. I have a piece of material culture, a prop that I'm going to ask someone to help me with. But what I want to do is to illustrate the difference between being an initiated member of a Sufi order, a silsila, a tariqa, and there's another term I'm going to introduce to you, which is a shajara, which means a tree, like a genealogical tree. Because many of us have become experts at looking for our ancestors through genealogical websites. So you can also do the same thing with the masters and disciples of a Sufi order and see how it branches out and how many... I wish that we had a way of tracking all this. There's actually an anthropologist at Jamia Millia in Delhi who has sent me some articles he's done to try to create a database of the Sufi shrines in South Asia. This would be a big project. Are you interested in that?
Yes. I'm glad, Professor Karl, that you have driven out the roadmap for the discussion that right from the 10th century, it's one of the greatest contribution I would say of Professor Karl Ernst is to come out of the Orientalistic approach when it comes to the mystical tradition of the East. Sometimes that writes off that it is not active or it is not a practice in today's time. It is something that is to be written only about the history. So through his work, as he was just mentioning about documentation of the Shijra Mubarak, when he talked about the order, of course it is more Western oriented, but the proper word I would suggest is lineage, that it comes through a direct lineage from generation to generation through a peer and murid relationship, a guru and shishya relationship, which the sacred knowledge or the intimate knowledge, it has started right in the times of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when a group of ascetic and mystics who used to sit outside his house, that porch is still known as the Ashab-e Sufa, people of the bench. And when during the day's gathering, in the evening, there were only select few who were passed on this knowledge from heart to heart. As Professor Karl has said, that not much was written by the elders of the Mashayikh Chishty, but a lot of teachings were passed on, transformed through heart-to-heart transformation of knowledge. We call it Sina Basina Ilm, sharing it from one heart to heart. That's what, like, even I had my spiritual master who taught us and who gave us a zikr. In Chishtiya Silsila, there are a different kind of zikr as the important aspect of Sama, which is the Qawwali, which is the spiritual nourishment for the Chishtis, and zikr. Zikr is not, of course, it is important aspect is a small husna recitation of the name, but even your service is a zikr. My Pir Murshid has guided me that in the Chishtiya order, there is a group of darwish which are called as the Syed darwish, the traveling darwish. Their way is to travel, and then the traveling becomes part of their meditation and the zikr. So to do immense spiritual service and the worldly service at the same time. In this tradition, there is no complete monastic life also. That you can't say, okay, I want to live rest of my life into a jungle or in a cave or on a mountain top that I'm connected with God. Of course, there is seclusion. We call it chilla, the 40-day meditation. You go in a cave or seclusion, but that attain spiritual powers through meditation and zikr, you come back to the society and serve the society. Hazrat Khaja Moinuddin Chishti, the 11th century Sufi master, his message was love towards all and malice towards none. He said that there are only two entities, the Khaliq, the creator, and the Makhluk, the creation. If you're doing your meditation, your beads, your prayer, your namaz, it is for you and your own personal elevation towards the spiritual realm. But if you want to serve the creator, serve the creation. Khizmat-e khalq. That is why an important aspect that I would like you to elaborate is the concept of serving meal. The Sufi meals at the Khankas. At all the Chishti Khankas, when you look at Baba Farid and how that interaction in Punjab led to the same tradition even actively being practiced at all the Gurudwaras. And the sayings of Baba Farid, part of the Guru Granth Sahib. So that is a beautiful way of elaborating the service towards humanity by active participation in daily life and serving humanity. Professor?
Well, let's hold on for just a moment and look at the prop that I brought. This is a scroll, and I'm going to ask somebody from our organization here to help me with this. I'm going to unroll this, and I'm going to ask, you can try to get a peek at this. This is a picture of a Sufi order, and as we unroll it, I'll try to explain what happens. Maybe just the two of you could unroll it between the two of you. Well, they can do it. They can do it. And be gentle.
Yeah, be careful. All right, now you take it. No.
This is a photocopy of a scroll that I saw many years ago. Can you take it all the way down to the door? And this is probably a postmodern version of it because I'm not absolutely sure that the order of the photocopied sheets is correctly reassembled. But keep going. I think it's about 40 feet. And this is only a portion of the original. And I think that you can see from where you are that particularly in the area that's closer to the top, there are many circles of different sizes. And the biggest ones are the masters of the greatest importance. And there's some text written in there which has biographical details. Oh, thank you. We need help. This is a big Sufi order. We need lots of people to... Yes, very nicely, gently. So if you can take a glance at this, this is a representation of the Sufi order. And why do we have this scroll here? This is incomplete. This would have gone all the way to the Prophet Muhammad. I'm not kidding. That's the whole point.
This is the traditional Shijra Mubarak or lineage, and lots of khankas do preserve them, but of course they're not out in public domain yet.
And let me explain the ritual significance of this. This was written out by hand by someone for a very important reason. That person was being initiated into the order, into the tariqah. And that person will write his name at the very bottom end of the scroll and literally inscribes himself into the lineage of the Chishtis. So this is, I think, a very powerful document which graphically illustrates the nature of, or the structure of this relationship. But the more you look at it, it's enigmatic. There are lines going between different figures. Does that mean they are disciples? Why is a member of the Sohrawardi order in here? Why are there people from, very famous people connected to this? There are some mysterious aspects, but I hope you will agree that this is an interesting glimpse into what constitutes these orders. And I should add that we had some discussion at an earlier session about printing coming rather late to the Middle East and South Asia. Towards the end of the 19th century, people would print out documents in a book form that contained the entire lineage of the Chishtis, and then there would be empty boxes on the last page for a new disciple to be written into the order. So that was a modern technological version of this initiatic scroll. And we can come back to this towards the end if we have time for some questions. But now, Salman has asked about the significance of the hospitality, the sacred duty of hospitality. And I think that this is very serious indeed. And if you've experienced it, you know that it's done with all sincerity, and people take it as a duty that is quite sacred. And you're quite right, Salman. We find that the discussion of the langar, the open kitchen, is very important. In the early days of Sheikh Baba Farid and Nizamuddin, they would get donations that would come in. They had to be spent that week. And how would they be spent? Largely on food for the poor. And anyone could come in. And I think this is unintentionally the place where the large public following of the Sufis was facilitated, and which encouraged the growth from below, not from the sheikhs dictating themselves, but from the love of the people, a whole series of stories, narratives about miracles and spiritual power, and an openness to community that was not defined or restricted by religious, ethnic, class, or other boundaries. And there were certain people who could come in. I mean, in India, there are some groups that observe strict dietary rules and would not be able to take advantage of the langar. But others were very happy to do so, and we know from what the sheikhs say that, see how carefully they're rolling up the scroll now. Thank you very much. Jogis would show up. They didn't have the same sort of dietary restrictions because they've gone through a ritual death and they're not part of the caste rituals. And so interesting conversations would take place. And some of the sheikhs would say, yes, what the yogis are doing is interesting. Controlling the breath is an important technique for concentration of the mind. And they compared notes on things. This is a whole subject, and much more could be said about it. But I think Salman is absolutely right to point out that this social institution of generosity and openness was a tremendous factor in creating the ethos that still survives in the shrines. And on the great days of memory, the day of the Urs, which is, in a way, the term itself means a wedding. When the soul of the saint was joined to God, tremendous amounts of charity are performed at the shrines, and there are special customs in Ajmer. There's the immense vats, or they're called the dig, dating from the time of Akbar, a spectacular display of distribution of food, which is unparalleled elsewhere. So this was a mechanism which was very important. And if you look at even the archival documents that survive from the shrines themselves, which include revenue documents in which kings would record their gifts, the provision of food was absolutely central. And it's not hard to guess why. People need to eat, and guess what? There are people who don't have food to eat. So this is a duty, a social ethic, which had tremendous implications for the formation of larger networks.
Absolutely, Professor Kaul. I'm like that. The Shajara was really something to see.
Great, yeah.
I mean, like as I said, that these are the tradition which are still very active and preserved into the intimate khanqahs which are practicing this tradition. We have them all over India, but this is not out yet into the public domain or even to the mainstream readings and sharings. So I'm glad that you could brought that, and the aspect of serving food about Ajmer Sharif is, of course, very well known. People who have visited from last 800 years. Every day, the food that is served inside the dargah is pure vegetarian. Not from now that we are hearing so much things about what to eat and what not to eat. The Sufis and the saints of the Chishtis and the Bhakti tradition, they have always worked on the way to brought the society onto the middle path. Don't be on the extreme on any side. From last 800 years, that time there was no masala. We're talking about even pre-Mughal when all these masala foods, they came in. So what used to happen, Professor Kaul, especially in Ajmer Sharif, there used to be some villages, and they used to send their crop to the dargah. And it used to just boil, put some salt and have it. That is today's like a porridge. That is the oldest langar khana which we still have. And the second one, of course, which you talked about during the 15th century, during Emperor Akbar time, when he walked all the way from Fatehpur Sikri to Ajmer to fulfillment of his wish that we pray to Allah for having a child. And on bestowing and fulfillment of the wish, he offered a big cauldron. A big cauldron is about 3,000 kg of food, which is cooked at one time. And again, that is a vegetarian meal. We'll have a small visual at the end of the talk. You can have a look at that.
That'd be nice, yeah.
So it is amounting, as I said earlier, that the sama is for the soul's nourishment. In the Chishti tradition, I had heard from my elders why the Qawwalis every day at the dargahs, because they say if the Chishtis, and it's a very extreme statement, Professor. I said this at the Harvard conference, and they were like, the students were, the Chishtis, if they don't listen to Qawwali, the Sama, for more than 3 days, they will die. It's not, of course, the physical death, it's about the sickness of the soul, the sadness of the soul. So we need to continuously nourish the soul the way we nourish a body. And the first effect of the sickness of the soul comes on the body. And that is on the face. If our soul is unhealthy, the noor of our face, the light, it's not the complexion of the face, but the light will be taken away. So these practices, where we talk about sama or langar and zikr, these were bringing the practitioners onto the middle path, having a part played in the world, but also in the spiritual world, and thriving to it.
I'd like to tell a story about this.
Please, Sufis are always full of stories.
That's right. This concerns a story you know very well about Sheikh Qutbuddin Bakhtiar Kaki, who was the teacher of Baba Farid. We're still talking about the Golden Age. I want to get back to the present before we're done. Now, he was a kind of person who was almost ecstatic much of the time. If you said salam to him, he would go into hal, as they say. And the story concerns a practice of sama. Now, I mentioned earlier that sama means listening to music. When we look at the books of adab, the books of the ethics, of the practices of the Sufis, they don't really talk about producing sound. They talk about listening. Not everyone hears things the same way. What level are you on depends on what you will hear. The same song will be heard by two different people. One person will become inflamed with ordinary passions, and another person will become drawn to God. So the rules that govern sama are rather strict. People should be in a state of purity, similar to prayer. They should maintain decorum, and there's a lot of discussion about ecstasy. What happens if people go into hal or wajd? In fact, there are special rules about people who fake ecstasy. This is considered to be a blamable hypocrisy that is just showing off. And there are people who do this, not surprisingly. But one rule which I think is interesting is that if somebody goes into hal, into a definite state of ecstasy, the assembly will rise out of respect, and the singer, the qawwal, will continue to repeat the same verse. Tikrar means repeat the same verse, until the ecstatic person returns to normal. I've seen this happen, and it is quite obvious, but it's very intense. Now, Qutbuddin was in a session where some poets were reciting the favorite poets of Khorasan, in particular Ahmad Jam. Jam and Chishty are these two towns in present-day Afghanistan which were the source of a lot of Sufi activity. And they came to a verse which goes like this: Koshtagane khanjare taslim ra, Koshtagane khanjare taslim ra, har zaman az ghaib jane digar ast. For those killed by submission's dagger, each moment, new life comes from beyond. So Qutbuddin was overwhelmed by this line, and he went into a hall, and the qawwals repeated the verse, and they repeated the verse, and they continued to repeat it for 3 days. And then he died. He was not the last. of the Chishtis, of whom it was said he died in Sama. It's happened in modern times. Sounds like a good way to go, perhaps. But it's about the listening, the intensity of the listening. Just as Rumi says, Nahar chashmi nazar dorad. Not every eye has vision. And you can find similar statements elsewhere. So having that ability to listen is a crucial thing. Now, I'd like to fast forward to one of the problems that Bruce Lawrence and I ran into. Now, I told you that when we looked at the scholarly literature about the Chishtis, there was vanishingly little to be found that dealt with the later periods of history. In particular, the colonial period and the modern period since independence. There was hardly anything written about the Chishtis, even though there were more sheikhs in later periods of history than in the early ones, by far. So that was really a challenge. And it was also interesting because the presence of the British changed a bunch of things as well. For instance, in Pakpatan, the shrine of Baba Farid in the Punjab, the British ended up choosing who would become the next administrator of the shrine, the so-called Divan. And the British, like colonial rulers elsewhere, were always concerned about large groups of people getting together, especially people who had strong loyalties to leaders who could potentially cause problems. So the British were eager to try to bring the sheikhs into some kind of relationship with the colonial state, and in some cases this was accomplished through the military or other forms of activity, or through the agricultural holdings that were part of the land that the shrines owned. So that's one interesting challenge. And at the same time, there were dramatic changes taking place in Muslim society during the colonial era. At the same time that the British and other Europeans first discovered Sufism, the so-called Orientalists, as Salman was mentioning, the British decided that they liked it. They thought Sufism was really interesting. There was poetry, there was beauty, intoxication. It couldn't possibly have anything to do with Islam, because Islam is legal, boring, dry, etc. And so from the very beginning, when Sir William Jones was writing in the 1790s, his first essays about the mystic East, the British decided that Sufism had nothing to do with Islam. And in the very first article written about Sufism, the British author actually concluded by saying, well, in India, we British are often considered to be Sufis because we don't care about religion and we like wine. I think they missed something there. But at the same time, new reformist movements were starting to happen among Muslims, which we here refer to as Salafi, as Wahhabi, as fundamentalist, and so forth. And a number of these movements saw Sufism as idolatry, that the pilgrimage to the shrines of Sufi saints was nothing but paganism, and that Sufis were remnants of superstition that should be kicked out. And this has happened in Saudi Arabia and in a number of places around the world where Sufism has been attacked from this sort of fundamentalist side. It's also been attacked from the secular side, because in Turkey, in 1925, Kemal Ataturk banned all the Sufi orders as part of the secular nationalization program that he was undertaking. Too much power was bound up with these orders. In Istanbul, before the First World War, as many as 1 man out of 8 was an active member of a Sufi tekke or shrine. And so if you can imagine how many more people were involved, it was pervasive. So what this means is that there have been ideological debates about Sufism that have been very intense. And there were members of the Chishty order who became more anti-traditional, I guess I would say, and who felt that pilgrimage was something to be avoided, and many traditional practices, including listening to music, they felt was questionable. So the founders of the Deoband Academy, which has now got a worldwide influence, were opposed to pilgrimage to Sufi shrines and to listening to music. Rashid Ahmed Gangohi, in his legal fatwas, said that, well, they were trained by Chishtis and they knew that there was spiritual power there. He said he does not deny that spiritual grace is to be found in the shrines of the sheikhs, but it looks too much like a Hindu temple. In other words, because of the politics of communalism at the time, traditional practices were being discredited and challenged, and that was a big change that took place. Although, of course, the shrines are still incredibly popular. How many people attend the Urs these days in Ajmer? Over 1 million, is that what I hear?
About 1 million people every year we get during the Urs time. Yeah, so Professor Karl, this is a very important aspect that you have shared during the colonial era, even after the post-colonial era. We have seen that the Britishers were not only interested in just dividing the borders of the world and ruling, but they also indulge in dividing and bring up the sectarian rift within the religion itself. When we look about the colonial period, and especially into the Indian or South Asian context, we know that during the 1857, the first revolt, a lot of Sufis were the first one who raised against the colonial rule. We look at the Haji Imdadullah Mahajer Makki, Hazrat Fazliha Khairabadi, who they took him to Andaman. I was there in Andaman. I went to pay my respect to his shrine, and he was one of the first freedom fighter in 1957. So the Britishers knew the spiritual strength of the faith and the religion in India is very, very crucial for them to continue ruling India. If they can break away the spiritual strength in all the religions that were practiced in India, not only Islam, they fractured other aspects of religious, spiritual traditions also. So at the same time, the Maududi, who was a journalist during, again, the British time, who propagated this, the Deoband and the Wahhabi creed and kind of patronized during the initial stage by the British to take forward this narration and the translations which were coming in from Saudi Arabia, which were kind of imposed on the madrasas. There was a time before the British era that all the madrasas were attached to a Sufi khanka. But after that, they started that the Sufi khankas were kind of discredited as some of the narration, and the madrasas were given a total autonomy on diverging and shaping the Muslim society. That rift kind of really gave the shape of this extreme and radical preachings that even continue till today. We are lucky that our Sufi and Bhakti traditions in India are so strong that the Indian Muslims are not getting influenced, and inshallah they will not get influenced by these radical ideologies of what we see around ISIS and the Salafis. They're creating havoc into the Middle East, you can see. Right. So this is, of course, the strong presence of the Sufi traditions, not in the Muslim society, but even beyond that. That on an average day, when you look at Ajmer Sharif, you talk about more than Muslim, non-Muslim people come there, and they feel that this is a place for their own. Because Ajmer Sharif के बारे में तो यही कहा जाता है कि अजमेर वही आते हैं जिन्हें ख्वाजा बुलाते हैं, और जब ख्वाजा बुलाते हैं तो बड़ी शान से बुलाते हैं. They're the only people who are called are coming to Ajmer. So everybody comes with this belief and faith system that it is we who are being called. So this has really, the dargahs and the spiritual centers has acted as the neutralizers to these extremist threat that is coming from outside India.
So the story of Sufism in the modern period is quite bumpy in a certain way, and it was also accompanied by a erosion of the traditional bases of support and patronage, of course, which were, if you like, feudalistic to a certain extent. But this meant that everything was configured in a new way. And under the modern nation state, the independent nation states of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and so forth are just as eager to control large religious establishments as their colonial predecessors, and they use some of the same legal instruments to do so. But I think the charitable trust situation has been in chaos for years. The British administration of these undermined the system considerably, and I know that's a concern that continues to be dealt with. Now, the other thing I'd like to talk about is the new popularization of Sufism through culture and particularly through music. In the early 20th century, we have to remember there was a big transformation of life, which was audio recording. Before about 1900, let's just remember this, all music was live. You had to be there to experience it. There were no recordings. But with the development of the phonograph, you had portable recordings that you could take to your home and construct a totally different relationship than was traditionally the case. Because in the privacy of your own home, you're not part of a community. There are other things going on. And the British facilitated the development of a recording industry that dealt with India. EMI and other recording agencies, you know, they saw a market. The term Qawwali, I think, really comes into play about the 1920s and 30s with the mass distribution of phonograph recordings of traditional Sufi music. And this creates a new world. I've translated a little manual which is called Adab as-Sama, the rules for Sama, that was composed in Urdu in the 1930s, and it addresses for the first time the musician, because the classical manuals are only about the listeners. The musicians were paid to be there to help other people have ecstasy. But now the musician becomes important. And there's also advice about, to the musician, don't be too greedy, but to the patron, you should be generous. And so there's a lot of things going on. But sound recordings create music superstars. And those people who like Qawwali music, who have listened to the Sabri brothers, or to Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, the great legends of the past generation, these people became stars in their own right. Abida Parveen in Pakistan, similarly. And so there's a new kind of relationship that's going on. And does anybody listen to Coke Studios? A lot of people. Okay, now go back and read Nizamuddin's Morals for the Heart, and you'll have a full picture of this. I know that you're getting a lot from Coke Studios, but wait a minute, Coke Studios. Did Baba Farid like Coke? No, we're in a different world when Coca-Cola is the presenter, is the new patron of Sufi music. And so there's a lot to be said about that, but I don't see it's necessarily bad or the decline from the golden age, but Sufi music as a kind of a world music category is involved with marketing and capitalism and all that kind of stuff. And so we have to just be aware that the ground rules are changing and things have been morphing into new forms. And this also includes, for instance, there are Sufi groups around Europe and America who are pretty much detached from traditional Islamic practices because in the modern world, there's no copyright. Everybody can go in their own direction. So Sufism is malleable and takes on new identities all the time. So Salman, I think we're going to see a clip, but how do you want to move from here?
Yeah, we can have some questions and then we can close it on that clip. So
Okay.
that would be, if any questions.
Okay, do we have a couple of questions? There's a lady in the front row.
Yes,
Yeah.
you mentioned some of the traditions like Silsila and Zikr and Sama. One of the ones that I've read about, and I wondered if you could just maybe speak on that. I don't even know if it's part of Chishty, but it is part of Sufi tradition that I've read about. It's called Sohbat, discourse. Could you maybe just speak a little bit about that? Because, I mean, there's not a lot of information that I've come across yet on that.
Well, sohbat means being in the presence, being in companionship. And sometimes people use it to refer to the oral teachings, the discourses. It's a term that's especially common in Turkish circles. And in modern Persian, to have sohbat, it means have a conversation with somebody. So that stresses the intimacy of oral communication, personal presence, no substitute for that. Yeah.
You spoke about how the British were saying that, that Sufism was not really Islam. And since you are aware that this is one of my subjects, I want a little clarity on that. When was this first said by the British, which is the manuscript that you are referring to, and the age? And also, when was the word Sufism actually came into the English language as from Tasawwuf? Because that really starts the ism bit and the separation of this whole false narrative that Sufism and Islam are separate. So when does Sufism, the word, actually come into the English language?
Well, Sadia, you're quite right to point attention to this because when we have an ism on the end of a word, this is part of the European vocabulary of ideologies, of philosophies, of contesting positions. It's become an ism. And then we're talking about doctrines, we're talking about sociology. It's a different... Tasawwuf means the process of becoming a Sufi in the ideal sense. And so I've argued there's a real difference between this. 1790.
Okay, 1790 was when the first word, when Sufism was used.
In Calcutta, Sir William Jones and his associates. And what they did was, you see, for the British, and we're almost out of time, all of the East was the same. And so, for them, Sufism, Vedanta, Buddhism, it's all the same, and it comes from India, probably. So they wanted to make that move. There's a lot to be said about this, but it's a very important issue. But we need to excavate that history a little bit better.
All right, so I think this is a very interesting phenomena which just happened during this talk. I think we all have experienced that. Look at the human psychology and what we feel when we're talking about love, human service. The heart was blooming like a rose. We were all smiling. But the moment we got into the talks about the British and the extremists and the policies, how it divided the spiritual traditions and gave way for extremists, and there was tension. There was tension within the heart. There was tension when we were describing it. I felt it, I'm sure. And then again, we talked about music, which Professor Carlos brought us back. So with this note, I mean, like, this is what I do in my personal life also, that whenever I'm going to take any decision, Professor Carl, when I reflect on the heart. That's what was taught to me by my master, my Pir Murshid. The heart, if it is blooming like a rose, go ahead with that decision. But if there is a and there is a needling pain, not a physical pain, within the heart, stop over. Reflect on the planning, reflect on the ideas that you're going about in your life or deciding about your life. Take your time. Don't just rush to that. So reflect on the heart, and thank you, Professor Karl. So I'll just finish this with Rumi, who has quoted so beautifully. I always end the talks with this, Baza, Baza, Haranche Hasti Baza. Sadbar, Gartho Bashikasti Baza. Idarga ma Umidast, Idarga ma na umidinis. Which translates as come, come, come whoever you are. Even if you have broken your vows of repentance, come again. Our doors are doors of hope. Our doors are not the doors of despair. So, Alhamdulillah, India has truly been the door of hope, not for us Indians, but truly for the entire world. And we continue in sharing and cherishing the greatest strength of our country, that is unity in diversity and immense spiritual tradition. With this note, just 2 minutes of visuals from Ajmer Sharif with, can we have the video? Few things that you can see what happens in Ajmer Sharif. People come with so much of love and heart.